Okay, so sorry for the delay. So thanks for having me and thanks for joining in. I think as Ray mentioned before, and Dave also, I think the key here was to have the interaction with the nanoSPA team to get all the information and background objectives out of the way and produce new data. So when I came on board, I was already using the SPA. I had this paper in PNAS in 2007 with Jonathan Jervich when I introduced the SPA for transport proteins. So for this reason, I'm giving a little bit of a background, what the SPA can do, why it's necessary, or why is it useful. And this is basically the point of my presentation. Just a short introduction. I'm at Columbia University in the Department of Psychiatry, and here you see basically where my lab is located, where I'm sitting right now. So hello to everybody out in the world here. So my focus is basically on transport proteins. So the application SPA works with any kind of proteins, but for me, I'm working with transport proteins. Those fall into the passive transport group, the active transport and group translocation. I have worked with basically all of these proteins in terms of the SPA application. My focus is mostly on secondary active transport proteins, meaning they have an energy gradient that drives the transport. In most cases I'm working with, it's the sodium gradient, sometimes proton gradient, but the principle is the same. And when I, as you probably also know, have the same experience by working with a transporter, a membrane protein, you want to analyze it in its most natural environment. So what you do in most cases, you start expressing this target protein in your cellular host system. Then you extract it with detergent. Masses have increased and broadened over time. It's not just only detergent, there are more technologies to extract proteins out of the membrane, and then to have a functional system to test the function of a protein, you reconstitute in liposomes. The other pathway that's been used more and more was crystallization and cryo-EM. Basically, you extract your protein out of a native membrane, you bring it back into an artificial membrane for functional studies or for cryo-EM, or you have it in a non-membranous environment. The question is, what is with the activity? How do you know that whatever you see in a structural snapshot is the reality of what the protein does if you see the functional groups being highlighted in your structure, or if it's just like an artifact? And as you all know, coming from a mixture of membrane protein in detergent solution and adding lipids, the road is tricky, so you can have issues with the lipid composition, the composition of your buffer, the type of detergent you're using, the amount of detergent you're using, the solubilization state, your protein and or your lipids are in. And also important is the lipid to protein ratio to make sure that your preparation works out in the most native way that you can imagine. Also, what I've seen over time, the means of detergent removal play a critical role in having functional preparations of protoliposomes, and same also goes for nanodiscs now. So this is a critical path that applies to basically any and all membrane proteins. And the point is, how do we assess the function of these? Ideally, you start with your membrane prep, and then you go into an artificial system. But as I mentioned, what's with the assessment of the activity, what is key here is you have to realize that there's a lack of compartments. So going from a cell into a non-vectorial environment, meaning you go into a system where you have no inside or outside, you lack the vectorial transport component of these transport proteins. So what's helpful here are binding studies. There are two, or at least two different types of binding sites. There's equilibrium binding, and there's an association dissociation binding approach. I show in some examples both types later on. And then over time, I realized, like in 2005 to 2007, I realized that the scintillation proximity assay would be a very powerful tool to get information on the activity outside of the membrane environment. It's a very homogeneous assay.